Hi, David.
Is that Charles?
Yep, Chaz. Yep.
Oh, yes. I always forget what your name is. Great to meet at last.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't you moving?
Because I'm eating and I didn't want to
I see.
show that I'm eating.
I wish I knew how to turn off the waiting room, but apparently I don't yet.
You can do that in settings. I can show you,
Okay.
but you can't do it while you're in the meeting.
Oh, all right. I'll just have to live with it then. It'll tell me. Hello, Patty.
Hi there.
This is the other fellow was Chaz Donald, the regular. Well, he's actually Chaz Andrews. He's a regular on the Fourth Turner. This is the first time I've
Hi
ever
there.
actually met him.
Hello.
We're going to be doing a quick test, Chaz, of the screen share, which is going to be key tonight. So here I go. How's that?
Can't see anything. I just see your page, your clips page.
I can see your clips page too. If you're trying to,
Wait a second, Chaz. We already did this once, so I think we can handle
No,
it.
no, you haven't. Listen to Charles.
Yes, go ahead.
if
Yeah.
you're trying to show a video clip, when
Yeah.
you switch between different windows, you have to stop share, then start share when you have the window open that you want.
Ah, okay. Unfortunately, okay. Well, now it's going again.
Yeah, now you have to hit
Oh,
share.
wait. Okay. How's that?
Nothing.
Nothing.
That didn't work because, just a second.
You need to make sure the clip is open before and then put it on hold before you try to use it.
Well,
What Patty said.
that's what I've done. It is open.
Okay, so the
So
clip is
now-
already open? Okay,
Yeah,
now go to
So now
share.
hit share. So now hit share.
Yeah. There you go. Okay. We're
That's
not getting
okay?
any, well, you're not getting any sound, so you'll need to do what you did before.
And
Yeah.
that was, we went to,
You went to share screen, advanced.
Settings, and there's a little checkbox that asks if you want to share computer sound.
right. I'm having trouble finding, oh, well, here we go. Yeah, right.
So you want to
I'm
both
just
share
trying to, I'm just,
and optimize the video.
wait a minute. I'm having trouble just getting the main screen back.
Okay, go up to the top and say stop share.
Wait a minute. I'm not there yet. Oh, stop share. Yes. Okay. Okay. There we go.
There you go.
Now, go down to share.
Right. And press the little carrot.
I haven't got the carrot.
Yeah, it's right next to the share.
Yeah. Okay. I pressed it. Advanced sharing on.
Okay, so there should be one that's, and then
Multiple
advanced,
participants can share simultaneously.
and then the advanced.
No,
will give-
that's not right. No, I don't want that. Okay. Yeah.
Advanced.
Advanced.
Okay, share audio,
That's not there for advanced.
share computer audio. We did that this afternoon.
Oh, well, that's, wait a second.
You do get a separate screen that pops up when it's asking you what screen you want to share, correct?
I got a separate screen, yes.
All
It
right,
said,
so
okay,
that-
here's optimized screen sharing for video clip and share computer
That's
sound.
good.
Yes, okay.
Okay,
There you
you
go.
got
That's
it.
what you
It should
need.
work now.
So now I can find it and start it again.
Well, did I act like that when I graduated from high school?
Pretty much.
And
You know, George, I wish we could send Harry to college with you. Your mother and I talked it over half the night.
Okay,
how's
you
that?
have
I
to
got it all
go,
figured out. See, Harold
you'll
take,
need to go back and put the share video or optimize video thing again.
What, you mean every time I do it?
No, I think it's supposed to happen once for the whole thing, but you might have to do it more than once.
Wait a minute, when I just ran it, was everything all right?
We could hear it, but
We
not
can hear it,
see
but not see it.
Oh, well, then there's a step we've missed.
Okay, so redo the optimized video thing.
The screen sharing is paused. Okay, so you want me to stop the share?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, here we are
Okay.
again. So, advanced sharing options. No, that didn't give that to me. Wait, I gotta hit share screen, don't I, to see those options?
No,
Yes.
you
No,
hit the little
everything
carrot.
is selected.
Even optimized video?
Yes,
Huh, that worked this afternoon.
yes, it did, but there's something that we forgot.
Did you have the clip up and ready and that's what you selected?
I do now, I think. So we could try that again. Let's see.
Okay,
Okay, share and go.
my job in the building alone, worked there for 4 years, and he'll go.
okay. We're not getting the
Pretty young,
video,
right,
we're just
John?
getting the audio.
Huh,
So go ahead and stop the share again.
yeah,
Okay, and open it up again and see what it says about sharing the video.
start share again, you mean?
No, don't start it. Just look at the settings for start share.
Okay, one
Good.
participant can share at a time, multiple participants, okay. Advanced sharing options. One participant at a time, who can share, only host. That's all that's there now. And it's only when I actually hit the share button, the share screen button, that I see those other options.
Okay,
And
you
they're
said
good.
they're all,
Oh, wait a second now. Ah,
Well, no younger than I was.
how we
good
doing?
There we
job.
go.
Okay, you got it.
Okay. Back to the beginning. Now, I'm gonna have to reload some when later, which, but we'll just have to be patient.
Can you do it ahead? No?
I don't think I can because as far as I can see, I can only get one oh, God, of those of those windows with that program open at the same time.
Charles, do you know how to do that? Is there a way
You
to do
should
more than
be
one?
able to. If you right click on the item and say open with, you should be able to.
Well, all right, let's do the next one.
Because it's a similar issue I've had with using Microsoft Paint. It doesn't want to open up a second one, but the workaround I always use with that is I right click on the item and then hit
Open
open with. And then
All right, now we got it, but.
there we go.
Well, yes, but that's
Terrific.
that one, but have we got the other one still? Is
What, the
problem.
first one?
Yeah, and actually, I have a
There,
terrible
no,
time.
David, can you see on your screen on the middle of where the video is? There's the little arrow that goes in the previous direction? No?
Yes,
Okay, try that.
No, that's not gonna be right. That's taking it out of the file. I mean, I could set up the file that way. Now, the trouble is I'm having a terrible time undoing these. All right,
Undoing
there we
what?
go. Okay, there are 2 more people in the waiting room.
Okay, why don't
So
you
I better get them.
close the share screen? Because you're not
Just a
gonna be
second.
able to see.
Yeah.
There's
okay.
Judy. Okay.
Yeah.
That's me, no picture.
Oh, Judy, how are you?
I'm okay, no picture.
Very sad not to see you.
I'm
After all
so
these years.
vain and I would just as soon you didn't see me.
Well, all right. Now.
Hey, Judy.
But Judy, you can see us.
I can see you, yeah.
Very
There's
good.
a
Okay,
lot of people right now, right?
right.
Yes.
And I can hear you.
Very good. Oh, we got somebody else waiting.
Hey, David.
Hi, Steve. How are
Doing great.
you? And I believe you've got somebody with you there.
Yes, Eileen is here with me. And I recognize Chaz. Hi, Chaz.
Hey, Steve.
Another Zoom room.
And let's see.
Another time.
There is Susan, whom I do not know. Susan has stepped away.
There she is.
Yes.
Hi.
Good
She's
evening,
from the
Susan.
saloon.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
she is.
hi.
That's right.
Sorry,
No
I had to go
problem.
get something.
We're going to have to wait, I would think, at least 5 minutes, because I know there are going to be more people.
Okay.
Oh, now here is a celebrity. Wonderful. But where is she?
There she is. She's
Janie.
right.
Hello.
Hi, Janie.
Great to see you.
All right, Patty.
Hi. I'm always waving with the wrong hand.
Yes. Okay, I have my chart ready.
Oh, very good. You're well prepared.
But you really have to read the last chapter of Fourth Turning to give you a little hope that maybe we will all survive this one.
We will get there, and I'm going to read a little from it myself in just a few
Okay.
minutes.
But the last chapter is good.
Yes, right.
David, just in case people don't know who Janie Strauss is, when you said she was a celebrity,
That's all right.
could
Patty.
you introduce her?
We're all going to introduce ourselves.
David, do you have a meeting ID and password for this? Because I want to switch over to my iPad.
I do have an ID. There isn't any password.
No?
No,
Okay.
I don't think.
There usually is.
The ID, let's see.
I don't think it was in your email.
Yeah, it's in the, no, not, oh, that's right. We did with email. That's why you haven't got it. Okay, the ID is 775-7555-4376.
Okay,
Right,
thanks.
sure. And now we have 2 more, including an old friend of mine who I haven't seen for years. Oh, and we have Dawson. Hello, Kevin.
All right.
Ah,
Hello, how are you doing?
fine, thanks. Good to see you.
I'll get my video up here in a minute.
Okay, and hello, James.
Hello.
Let's see. We have more people. Yes. Okay, I'm going to give it until about 8:05. Hello, Michael?
Okay, you have to let me in again.
Oh, I do?
Yeah,
Oh,
because
yes, so I do, yes. Okay, you're in.
okay, thank you.
Now, let's see what happens when I do gallery view. Yeah, okay, gallery view is working well. Yes, I can see everybody. Just about. Oh, hello, Cousin Tamara.
Hi.
How did you sneak in? Okay. I'm really hoping that, well, obviously I want as many people as I can, but I'm really hoping that everybody fits on one screen, because otherwise calling on people is going to become a nightmare. Also, a couple of people aren't showing moving pictures.
What I understand, the thumbnails just keep shrinking.
Yeah, I think that's right, more or less. Patty, what's the biggest one you've had?
There is a
been on?
limit to how many.
Yeah. Patty?
Me?
Yeah, what's the biggest?
I
biggest
think
number?
there were 75.
Oh, boy. Okay, well, we're going to 75. Hello,
I'm
Jocelyn.
with 130.
Hi, how are you?
After a certain point, it just turns into many different pages. I've had
Yeah.
a few round tables where we've had over.
Hello, Ben.
Hello, David. Good to see you. Thank you
Good
for
to see
doing
you.
this.
Oh, not at all. Great to see you here. And hi, Michael. Are you hearing us? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, no problem. Well, we're up to unlucky 13. And it's 8:04. But I guess we could get going, particularly since the first thing I think we ought to do is introduce ourselves, and just for kicks, when you introduce yourselves, I'm asking for 3 things, and I know if you want to add. First of all, your generation. Second of all, your parents' generation. And third, in just a few words, how you happen to be here. So based on my screen, I'll start at the upper left with Patty Cassidy.
Hi, I'm Patty Cassidy. What am I supposed to say? I'm a boomer.
Yes.
My parents were GI and lost. And how am I here? I live
Yes.
with you, David.
Yes, I know that, but not all of them do. All right, I guess I should do the same. I'm next. You know why I'm here. And I'm a boomer, and I had GI parents. Oh, yes, and also I have an Xer son and a millennial son. So it might be fun for those of you who have kids to identify their generation as well. Okay, Charles Andrews.
I'm Chaz Andrews. I am a millennial. My parents were on the border between silent and baby boomer.
Steve Barrera. And
Yeah, I'm Steve Barrera, and this is Eileen McCulloch, my friend and partner. We are both Gen Xers, very close to the same age. My parents are boomers, but Eileen's parents are silent. Eileen has 2 millennial children. We are here because I've been interested in generations for a very long time. And I've heard about this class through having known David online for such a long time. And I just want to point out an interesting fact. I know for a fact that my father and Chaz's father were born the same year. But Chaz is 22 years younger than me. So that's just an interesting example of how generations can work out.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Janie Strauss.
unmute. Okay, I'm Janie Strauss. My husband, Bill, wrote Fourth Turning with Neil Howe. And Bill and Neil did all the generational stuff. I am a boomer. My parents were GI. I have 4 children. 3 are comfortably millennials. 1 is on the cusp of millennial and Gen X. I have 4 grandchildren, and they are all Homelanders. And when Bill and Neil began their writing partnership, their intent was not necessarily to come up with this whole idea of the saeculum and the rhythm of repeating generational. Bill's first idea, he had finished a book called, his first book was called Chance and Circumstance, which was about the Clemency Board, which he helped run after the Vietnam War. And his next book he wanted to write was, he was going to talk about the assets and the contributions of all living generations. And when they began researching it, they had a pretty amazing aha moment. And, you know, the rest is all the books that have come on. Bill unfortunately passed away in December of 2007. His writing partner, Neil Howe, is continuing on. He works for Bill's consulting company, was purchased by another company by the name of Magi, that does huge consulting work for marketing and investment, big investment funds. And Neil's piece is to comment on demographics, history, and the impact, potential impact of changes in generations on marketing and et cetera, et cetera. They are very, very busy right now. And my daughter, Vicky, also works for them. So that's where I come from.
Okay, thank you, Janie. It's great to have you here. Now, just a clarification for some of the people who've just come to this. Janie referred to her grandchildren in the Homelander generation. That was the term that Bill and Neil had coined, actually just about the time they were starting to be born, as we think now, for the new artist generation, the post-millennial generation. I'm afraid it looks like Homelander isn't going to catch on. Gen Z seems to be pretty much the accepted definition, so that's what I used in the presentation, and I think that's what we'll be using there.
Neil is using Homelander.
I'm sure he is, but okay.
I remember well the weekend that we all argued what to call what turned out to be the millennial.
Well, so far, as I put it out in the presentation, they're 1 for 2. 13er never caught on, but millennial did. So this will be the tiebreaker. Okay, Tamara Kaiser.
I'm Tamara, and I'm a boomer, and my parents are also GIs. And I found out about this whole idea from my cousin David, who talked to me about it. And then I read his book where I learned more about it. And so I was very excited to do this. My children are Gen Xers, and my grandchildren are also Homelanders / what was the other term? Generation Z?
Yes, right.
Gen Z. Yes, and I'm very interested in how this all plays out in the future generations. So,
yeah, Jim McClatchy.
Yeah, I'm an Aquarian boomer, born 1950. I have millennial children. I had GI parents, and I came here because I read Generations, 25 years ago, and got hooked into various forums along the way, including the currently active one on Facebook.
Thank you. Jocelyn Dunton.
Hi, I'm Gen X. Actually, I think I'm right on the border between Boomer and Gen X. I'm very older Gen X, younger Boomer, I guess. My parents are silents, and I'm here because I'm a fan of classic film, and I know David and Patty from Turner Classic Movie Fan Club and the New Yorker Facebook group, movie Facebook group, and I'm always looking for a new lens to examine classic film. And I also think this is a fascinating topic that I'm interested to learn more about, the generations and so forth. So.
Thank you. Michael Levin.
Hi, my name is Michael Leviton. I was born in 1960, which appears to make me a baby boomer. My parents were born in the 1930s, which appears to make them silents. I'm here because I'm a longtime student of David's, although it's been approximately it's going to be more than 35 years since I was last in class with David. So I'm really looking forward to this experience because I'm always interested in learning new things.
Thank you, Mike. Ben Levy.
I'm a boomer, but one parent was lost, and the other, fortunately, he got found before I was born. And my other parent is a GI. I'm a classmate of David's and also of Bill Strauss's, and a film buff. And so the happy constellation of friendship and film brought me to this course.
Thank you. Susan Lewinnick.
Okay, I didn't know that I was going to be called upon to actually apply what I read.
Oh, that's right, because I put that on the Facebook page. I'm sorry. I have to make sure to get everybody an email at once.
I'm staring at the slides and have been able to figure out that I'm a silent. My parents were both lost and GI generations. So there was like an 11-year gap in their ages. I'm here because I've been in the saloon group for a brief period. I'm probably the newest member, and got David's message about forming this discussion group, and I love film and always interested in courses about film. So I thought I just want a shot.
Okay, thank you. Kevin Darnell.
What happened here? Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry for the delay. I was catching up as well on. So I am Kevin Darnell. I am a boomer. My parents were silents. I have one Gen X son and two millennial daughters. I had the great pleasure of being David's student at the Naval War College. And then for a short time, we taught together. And one of the more rewarding periods of my own military career. And it's a pleasure to meet you all.
Thank you, Kevin. And now Judy Bell.
I'm Judy Bell. I am an early boomer. No, a late boomer. And
no, you're early boomer, Judy.
GIs.
Early boomer, Judy.
Early boomer, right. I have to look at the form here. And my parents were late GIs. And my children were both Gen X. And I have Gen Z grandchildren. And I know Patty and David from, we were in a film discussion group when David and Patty were in Jamestown. And I'm a retired librarian, so I'm always interested in things.
Thank you, Judy. James McClatchy, your brother, showed up a few minutes ago and I admitted him. His picture never came up. And just about half a minute ago, he disappeared again. So.
Okay, well, I can speak for him. He's a 45 cohort.
Oh, okay.
And like me, has GI parents. He's got 3 Xer children and a Gen Z grandchild.
Well, I hope he pops back up, but at any rate, I was a little slow getting him in, but he was there for a few minutes. Well,
He knows how to use Zoom.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you all. I'm delighted to have this response, and it's great to see many of you again, including the ones I haven't seen for a long time, and the ones who I've never seen until this moment. Now, I started giving this course in 1998 at the Naval War College, and I gave it for the next 13 years or so, including one iteration with millennials at Williams College. So quite a bit of time has passed since 2012, the last time I taught it, and we are further along into the crisis. Now, you're familiar now with the basic scheme of the 80-year cycle and the crisis every 80 years. And the design of the course now is to look at the last crisis, what it did to the generations in it, how they handled it, how they coped with it, and then start looking at what came out of it. And we'll look at that through movies in a few other ways, and not only from the movies we watched, but from a few short movie clips that I've prepared. And we'll be spending 2 or 3 weeks on this crisis. And then we'll look at the high, the awakening, and the unraveling, and the gradual disintegration of our political order in particular that's taken place. And we'll try to use various sources to figure out how all this has come about and where it's going. We're going to be looking at all the generations that have been alive in these last 80 years, but I think it's fair to say that we'll spend the most time on GIs and on boomers, but certainly not to the exclusion of everybody else by any means. Now, what Bill and Neil, I'll refer to them that way, I guess, anticipated, even before this book, actually, when they wrote Generations, which I think came out in 1991, isn't that right, Danny? Yeah, was they had done the math on the 80-year cycle, and they predicted that in the first 15 years or so of the 21st century, we'd be in another great crisis. And that prediction has come true. And it always disturbs me that even though it's come true, they still have not won a great deal of recognition in the major media, although they have among the American public. Now, I do want to turn to a later point of the fourth turning and read on pages 272, 73, 5 scenarios that they talked out as to how the next crisis might get going, which does make very interesting reading. First, beset by a fiscal crisis, the state lays claim to its residents' federal tax money. Declaring this an act of secession, the president obtains a federal injunction. The governor refuses to back down. Federal marshals enforce the court order. Similar tax rebellions spring up in other states, etc. And it concludes with demands issued for a new constitutional convention. That's number 1. Number 2, remember, this is 1997, this is coming out. A global terrorist group blows up an aircraft and announces it possesses portable nuclear weapons. The United States and its allies launch a preemptive strike. The terrorists threaten to retaliate against an American city. Congress declares war and authorizes unlimited house-to-house searches, etc., etc. Number 3, an impasse over the federal budget reaches a stalemate. The president and Congress both refuse to back down, triggering a near total government shutdown. The president declares emergency powers. Congress rescinds its authority. Dollar and bond prices plummet. Wall Street panics. Number 4, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announced the spread of a new communicable virus. The disease reaches densely populated areas, killing some. Congress enacts mandatory quarantine measures. The president orders the National Guard to throw prophylactic cordons around unsafe neighborhoods. Mayors resist. Urban groups battle suburban militias. Calls mount for the president to declare martial law. And lastly, growing anarchy throughout the former Soviet republics prompts Russia to conduct training exercises around its borders. Lithuania erupts in civil war. Negotiations break down. U.S. diplomats are captured and publicly taunted, etc. Now, I always refer people to those pages because it seems to me that they would convince even the most confirmed skeptics that these guys were onto something. In fact, I would say 3 of those scenarios, or modified versions of those scenarios, have already occurred. Starting with 9/11, then the financial crisis, By the way, I've just been warned that my connection is unstable. We had a little problem earlier today, but no, it's okay now. And the financial crisis and now the epidemic. But we haven't had the response to the crisis they anticipated, which would involve the emergence of what they called a great champion, the great leader in the mode of Lincoln or FDR, a great mobilization comparable to the Civil War or Second World War of some kind to deal with the problem, and thus a renewal of faith in the government, a new consensus, and the opportunity to move into a new era. And the question is, why has this not happened? Where are we in the crisis, and where are we going? Now, this is an enormous subject, and on the Facebook page that actually any of you would be welcome at, and that many of you are on, and the forum that we had before that, we've been arguing about those questions for over 20 years without any consensus. A lot of this has to do with what people hope to happen, I think it's fair to say. Many people who are very unhappy with the current situation and who are looking for something completely different want to date the beginning of the crisis rather late, usually around 2007 and 8, which is when Neil Howe dates it, in the hopes that there will be a real turnaround in the next 5 years or so, and we'll get going in another direction. I used to hope for that myself, and I can document all this on the blog I've been writing now since 2004, historyunfolding.com. But some years ago, I began to realize that we weren't heading for some sort of new deal or what I would call regeneracy of the kind we had in the last crisis. We're going somewhere different. I'm just doing that to introduce. I don't want to start that discussion now. We're going to be having it a lot late in this experience, but I just wanted to put that on the table. I do feel that a new order is being created and has been created over the last 20 years or so, although I'm not very happy with it. And I would tend to call it a new disorder instead of a new order, but that's all for the future to discuss. And in the meantime, that's just my opinion. Now, about the films, I think they're all very enjoyable films to watch. I tried to pick a number that do have broader social or political significance. Also, I just want to point out now that there are pairs of films that fit together. We have two films about wars, Mr. Roberts and Born on the 4th of July. We have two films about returning veterans in different eras, An Apartment for Peggy and Born on the 4th of July. And we have two very different films, An Apartment for Peggy and Getting Straight, about college life in different eras. And these are things that I think will make discussions very interesting. In most of the films, the actors are playing characters from their own generation. There are a few exceptions. And thus, we will recognize a lot of generational characteristics that are in trouble, starting tonight. So now I want to leave the movie aside for the moment. We're not going to turn directly to it for a while. But since you're all here, and since particularly some of you are completely new to the subject matter, I'd just like to throw things open to general questions for a little while, and anything you would like to raise that particularly struck you in your reading, anything where you'd like a little further clarification, et cetera, et cetera. So fire away. I can see everybody. That's wonderful. So just raise your hand.
So David?
Yes, Jocelyn.
Yeah, just a question. And I've started the book. I'm about, I don't know, 50 to 80 pages in, and just curious about, you mentioned these different crises, and the crisis period is the 20-year period. And I'm just wondering whether these crises need to be related to one another, or can it be a series of unrelated crises, or just an era of lots of crises, or how do you think about that?
The way I look at it is that it's the death of an old order and the birth of a new one. And you see, that's one of the things we're going to be able to do with the course, that the course has always been able to do. We're going to look quite closely at the 50s, early 60s, the order that was created by the last crisis, and then we're going to see it challenged and break down in a number of ways. But within those periods, yes, there are always a number of things happening, but there's one consuming, well, one or two, I guess, consuming struggles. First, the American Revolution, then the Civil War, then both the struggle and the Depression and the Second World War. That's true. Yeah. Does that answer it more or less?
Yeah, because I guess I'm thinking about now, you know, we have 9/11 in
Yeah.
2001, and then fast forward almost 20 years, and we have this pandemic, you know,
That's
which
right.
is clearly a major crisis. And then those two things span this 20-year period, I think the authors were talking about in terms of the fourth turning. So
That's true. And the issue is which of those are going to look like the events that created whatever the new order turns out to be when it has emerged.
okay.
And again, I could talk for an hour about that right
Okay.
now, but that's not what we're here to do. Yes, Cameron.
I have two questions. One, the authors have referred a number of times to the fact that there was no hero generation in the Civil War.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that we're going to get the reason for that as we keep reading, or are we?
Well,
just, they never say why. They say that happened, at least.
Well, I think what they were getting at was, well, they're getting at a couple of things. They didn't see the characteristics of a hero generation, but the Civil War did not produce strong new institutions to the same extent that the American Revolution and the Second World War did. And I'll be talking about that in just a minute. Now, that has turned out to be very important to our understanding of what's going on now, because there is a parallel. Oh, we've lost Janie for the moment. Well, I'm sure she'll do that. You see, at the time they wrote this book, the millennial generation, the oldest millennials were about 16 when they wrote this book. They really anticipated that they were, oh no, there you are, Jane, that they were going to be mobilized the way the GIs were in the Depression and the Second World War. And that was going to shape them in the way it shaped the GI, which we'll be talking about tonight. Now, clearly, that has not happened. The oldest millennials are now pretty close to 40. The youngest ones are probably about 24. So in the same way, the millennial generation is not going to be, I think, all that similar to the GIs in midlife. So that is one reason why that is very important. Now, actually, I'll just say this and then we'll have to move on, but some of us now have come to think that within there's a cycle of crises with one, the American Revolution creating stronger institutions, the next one, the Civil War, not doing that, the one after that again creating strong institutions, and now we're still in a reaction to that, and we're going to emerge from this with weaker institutions than we had in the 40s and 50s and early 50s.
My second, can I just ask my second
sure.
question?
Yeah. Go ahead, Cameron.
It's a math question. He kept saying that the people who are our shadow side would be 4 generations away from us.
Yeah.
And that's why grandchildren and grandparents tend to connect, because they're similar in that way. No, the people who are like us, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Are 4 generations away from us. So that would be, and that would be our grandchildren. And I keep doing the math and coming up with, no, it would be our great grandchildren.
Well,
So-
it depends on, well, it depends. It depends on how old they are when people have kids. Now you and I did have a couple of missionary grandparents, but no, I had 3 missionary grandparents, but unfortunately I never knew any of them. So, I mean, one of them certainly, I do recognize as having been very much like me, but she was dead a long time before I was born. I don't know what you would think about that.
And they were prophets the way.
Yes, that's right.
Okay,
That's right.
somehow, and I kept doing the math, even changing when my grandchildren, just, okay, if everybody was born 20 years, it still was coming out wrong in my head. And I just.
That's right, but 20 is pretty much a minimum for that.
Yeah.
As we all know.
And so it would have to be a longer amount of time.
Yeah.
Anyway, it just wasn't quite adding up, but that's okay.
Yeah. Janie, do you have your hand up?
Yes.
Oh.
So to me, oh, you said Janie or James?
I said Janie. Janie Strauss,
Okay, Janie,
do you have
you
your
go
hand
ahead.
up?
Yes, I did. Okay, and then after me, James. Yeah.
Sure, right.
First, a couple of things. Bill always said that after the crisis of fourth turning, there is no, and again in the book, particularly at the end, there is no guarantee that a nation will rise or fall, but that there will be a dramatic change in mood and institutions and different ideas of how to go forward. But as it was clear as we sort of came through this new century of, a fourth turning seems to be coming along, I think there was a sense that somehow we would come through this stronger, better, that the millennials would save us. And in this last election cycle, because Bill talks about a great champion, an older boomer that would force the resolution of the crisis and take us through. But what Neil talked about, he said, I think unfortunately Trump is going to win, and we are not going to necessarily, be led to some great success. And so here we are. And that was what Bill would always say, a crisis as in a fourth turning leads to empire building and empire collapsing, that there's no guarantee that you come out at the other end stronger, better, wiser, what have you. But at the other end, you will be different. And there will be tremendous changes and a demand for changes, but different countries will take the lead. And the US may not necessarily be the glorious victors as we go through this. The other thing I wanted to say is the length of a generation, as Tamara, you were saying, 20 years, the length of a generation can vary anywhere from 17 to 22 years. Yes, David?
Sounds right.
And so there's no, it's not a set in stone length. And in terms of the Civil War, Bill always felt that the crisis of the Civil War came too soon in the cycle. And he said that also, he felt, led to the Reconstruction period that was so destructive and did not end up in solving slavery or civil rights, and also there not being a true hero generation. So who knows? But he always thought that if they could have put off the crisis, but they're in the crisis, that maybe the Civil War would not have been as destructive, and there would have been construction of better institutions that would solve the whole civil rights issue. So, thoughts?
Okay. Oh, hi, Judy. Yes, James. Thank you, James.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, and many interesting things about the theory, but what I came away with is the idea that it's really family situations that bring about the change of generations, that we react to our parents and then our children react to us, and that sort of cycle keeps the process going. What's interesting to me is I think the phrase they use is social moments, that how do the social moments change the way generations develop as opposed to their families of origin. For example, if the Vietnam War had happened in 1955 instead of 1965, would the generations have developed differently? If the pandemic had come in 2030 instead of 2020, how would the generations have changed? Because some of these things seem to almost happen by accident. And it's I think what the book says, it's the reaction to the social moment that counts, And it's not the social moment itself that's formative.
Yes, I think that's very true. And similar events in different periods provoke completely different reactions. And we will be able to see that very clearly in some of the situations that we look at in different eras in the movie. Anything else? Okay, what I want to do now for 10 or 15 minutes, maybe. Oh, yes?
Okay, one more. I was going to say
Sure.
that Bill would always say that there will always be sparks of history that are simply unpredicted. It just happens. But James, you were saying that it is the response to the spark of history that defines sort of the mood and how the living generations respond to that spark of history seems to line up to these cyclical patterns. So yes, if the Vietnam War had been, but we had the Korean War in the 50s, and it had a different, people responded to that differently than when the Vietnam War came. So it's really the response to the crisis, how well you handle a crisis, how well you pull yourself through, and if there are dramatic changes as a result of that spark of history. So.
Okay. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit. We're going to move into the last crisis, which is where we were at the time of our first film. But I'm going to look at it from a much broader political angle and make a couple of points in different ways. Okay, I've said that each crisis is marked by the end of an old order and the construction of a new one. And the old order at the time that the last crisis began in 1929 was still, in a number of ways, the post-Civil War order. Now, we've been talking about the Civil War and what it did and did not do already. It did preserve the Union. We did have the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution, which changed the nature of citizenship, opened up the right to vote in theory, before too long, not in fact, for the free slaves. But then we moved into an era of terrific economic progress, but also corporate power, growing inequality, huge corporations and monopolies, and a very unregulated and actually quite unstable economy. One of the things that you can't get away from when you study this stuff is the many similarities between what we call the Gilded Age in the 1870s and 80s and 90s and the way things have been going in the last 20, 30 years, which actually there's been a lot to talk about in the press. Now, in addition, this was an era of emerging great power competition all around the world, and the United States got involved in that in a small way in 1898, and then in a much bigger way in the First World War, starting in 1917. Meanwhile, the progressive era had begun, as many of you, as you all remember, in the late 1890s, 1900s. It was fueled by a concern over inequality and injustice, and by the decay of democracy, as was understood. So there were a lot of things done to improve the democratic process. The idea of presidential primaries and other primaries comes in, referendums in many states, et cetera, et cetera. And some protections for labor unions begin to be introduced, the Federal Reserve is passed, et cetera, et cetera. The progressive era, though, goes into eclipse in the 1920s in the wake of the First World War. And then, of course, comes the Great Crash. Now, by the time of the Great Crash, the post-Civil War generation, the missionary generation, born, in my opinion, from about 1863 to 83, is in middle age and coming into power. They were the focus of a book that I wrote and published in 2014 called No End Save Victory, How FDR Led the Nation into War. And this is the second historical work I'd written in which I had made a lot of use of the theory. And I felt I got to know the missionary generation quite well. They really had, I thought, a lifelong mission of turning chaos into order. And just to give you a little sneak preview where we're going, it often occurs to me that my own boom generation seems to have a lifelong mission of turning order into chaos. But we will have time to look at that in great detail as time goes on. Now, the missionaries produced 4 presidents: Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, and Franklin Roosevelt. And Hoover and Roosevelt had to try to cope with the crisis. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what FDR did and what the state of the country was in the 30s, partly because this is definitely background to They Made Me a Criminal in a number of ways, but for other reasons too. You will remember that when Roosevelt came in 1933, it was a moment of almost complete economic collapse. There was 25% unemployment and the whole banking system was failing. So the first thing he had to do was to get Congress to pass a bank holiday where all banks were closed for, I think, about a week. And then they set up the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. They later set up the SEC, regulated banking in many ways, the Glass-Steagall Act. So as a result, although major panics in the banking system had been common even since before the Civil War and had occurred every 5 or 10 years, say, from the Civil War until 1929, we did not have another one for 80 years. There's that magic number again, after 1929. So that was one achievement. And they did a lot of other things, founding the modern welfare state, Social Security, rights of labor protected in the Widener Act, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to stress something that isn't mentioned as much, that Roosevelt and the whole missionary generation, I think, took a moral approach, among other things, to the great problems that they had to deal with. And to make that point, I want to give you one of my favorite quotes from FDR's first inaugural. We all know all we have to fear is fear itself. But there is another section of that inaugural which I think is equally interesting, and again, particularly today. So here he is on March 4th, 1933, at the moment of this catastrophe. And I quote, "Our distress comes from no failure of substance. Plenty is at our doorstep, but a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of the supply. Primarily, this is because rulers of the exchange of mankind's goods have failed through their own stubbornness and their own incompetence, have admitted their failure, and have abdicated. Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truth. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit. Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money, it lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort. The joy and moral stimulation of work no longer must be forgotten in the mad chase of evanescent profits." Now, we have all lived through the replay of that moment in 2007 and 2008. But we did not hear words echoing those from the mouths of either of the presidents in power at that time, either George W. Bush or Barack Obama. They treated it as a technical problem that needed some fix-it solutions, and then we could get back to normal. And now, for a variety of reasons, really, because it isn't just the COVID epidemic, we're faced with another crisis. But again, I want to stress the nature of that. And now, I want to give you a first clip from another movie to make the same point. This is from a movie I'm sure you have all seen. It's A Wonderful Life. And this is an interesting scene fairly early in the movie when I believe George is just about to go out to college. Yes, I believe it's another high school graduation. And he's having a sit down with his father. And they talk about George's future. And it turns out to be a very influential conversation in his life. So I hope that I can make this screen share go smoothly. I think I can. We rehearsed this a couple times, but bear with me if I don't. Uh-oh. The one we want is, okay, just a moment.
Well, did I act like that when I graduated from high school?
Pretty much.
Is everybody seeing that?
No.
You know,
No?
George, I wish we could send Harry to
You're not seeing it?
No.
There we go again, sorry.
You need to click to the screen where the film is.
That's what I did.
No, I
All
think
right, we're
you're
going
on
to
the
stop.
screen with the menus of the film.
Yeah.
Okay, the problem is we tried something and it didn't work. But now I think we're going to be all right.
college with you. Your mother and I talked it over half the night.
We have that all figured out.
Is that all right?
Yep.
See, Harry will take my job in the building alone, work there for 4 years, and he'll go.
Pretty young for that job.
Well, no younger than I was.
Well, you were born older, George.
How's that?
I say you were born older. I suppose you've decided what you want to do when you get out of college.
Oh, well, you know what I've always talked about. Build things, design new buildings, plan modern cities. All that stuff I've been talking
Still
about.
after that first million before you're 30, huh?
No, I'll settle for half that in cash.
Of course, it's just a hope, but you wouldn't consider coming back to the building alone, would you?
Well, Well, Annie, why don't you draw up a chair? Then you'd be more comfortable and you could hear everything that's going on.
I would if I thought I'd hear anything worth listening to.
You would. I know it's soon to talk about it.
No, Pop. I couldn't. I couldn't face being cooped up for the rest of my life in a shabby little office. No, I'm sorry, Pop. I didn't mean that. It's this business of nickels and dimes and spending all your life trying to figure out how to save 3 cents a length of pipe. I'd go crazy. I want to do something big and something important.
You know, George, I feel that in a small way we're doing something important. It's satisfying a fundamental urge. It's deep in the race for a man to want his own roof and walls and fireplace. And we're helping him get those things in our shabby little office.
I know, Pop. I know that. I wish I felt that I've been hoarding pennies like a miser here in order to... Most of my friends have already finished college. I just feel like if I didn't get away, I'd bust.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You're right, son.
You see what I mean, don't you, Pop?
This town is no place for any man unless he's willing to crawl to Potter. Now, you've got talent, son. I've seen it. You get yourself an education and get out of here.
Pop, you want a shock? I think you're a great guy. Well, did you hear that, Annie?
I heard it's about time one of you lunkheads said it.
I'm going to miss old Annie. Pop, I think I'll get dressed and go over to Harry's party.
Have a good time, son.
Okay. So you see him putting it in the context of a broader mission, and to some extent or more, one of giving everybody a home. And FDR used that kind of language all the time. The missionary generation is represented in They May Be a Criminal in the person of Grandma, and I'll talk about her a little when we get there. Also, of course, her brother, the priest, who plays a major role, even though we only see him as a picture, but they're very much part of it. Now, just a couple of words about the lost generation, since, as I said, I'm trying to lay the framework for the crisis here. They had been born starting about 1883, 1884, and were born for about 20 years further, in my opinion. They grew up during an awakening, just the way you Gen Xers grew up during an awakening. And we don't know that much, I think, maybe about the 80s and 90s in this respect. But what we do know from the 60s and 70s is an awakening is a wonderful time to be a young adult and a pretty terrible time to be a kid, frequently, because the adults' minds are on other things. At any rate, the Lost Generation also certainly had a reputation as bad kids. The men of the Lost Generation fought the First World War, and in total contrast to the GIs, received very little in return. Some of you may remember that in 1930 or 31, the veterans came to Washington begging for their bonus money and were dispersed with tear gas instead of getting it. They did get off to a good economic start in the 20s, and they had to deal with the 30s. They felt very self-reliant, as I think many of you Xers do too, and they expected everybody else to be the same. And as a result, it's pretty clear that as a group, they were pretty negative about FDR and the New Deal. And they viewed the GIs as coddled kids, the way a lot of Xers have viewed millennials, I think it's fair to say. They became key middle managers in the crisis, and in particular in the Second World War, where most of the major military leaders in the field, starting with Eisenhower and many of the naval commanders, were from the Lost Generation. Then they contributed two presidents, Harry Truman, a World War I veteran, and Dwight Eisenhower. And they too figure, and they made me a criminal, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, let me just try to place the GIs, whom almost everybody knows, either as a parent or a grandparent, in certain respects, where they were in the 30s as we move towards the movies. They had been, Strauss and Howe argued in generations, quite carefully brought up by the missionaries, and then some of them by the Lost. In the same way that the millennials were brought up with considerable care by the boomers. Some of them had Lost Generation parents, and Lost Generation parents, as you can see from some of the literature written by GIs, tended to be helicopter parents. Willie Keith in the King Mutiny certainly has a mother who could give any helicopter parent today a run for her money. Now, they were relatively well educated, both men and women. And they were very fortunate, the GIs, to grow up when they did, because higher education at that point, and even during the Depression, if it was public higher education, was almost free. My parents met attending the University of Wisconsin in the early 30s. And I think my father paid about $100 a semester for tuition. He was out of state, and my mother paid about half of that because she was in state. And so it really was possible, as the saying goes, to work your way through college in those days, and quite a few people did. I did look up some figures. 9% of college-age people were in college in the 30s. Not very much by today's standard, but it was going up. And 40% of that 9% were women, which I think will come as a surprise to many people. But GI women were quite well educated. But then they reached young adulthood. In the Depression, their outlook looked grim. A lot of college-educated people and even grad school-educated people could not get jobs in their chosen profession in the 30s. There is a parallel to that situation actually now, not in the US, but in some of the European countries, where, again, education is free. And I have been on a number of bike trips, guided bike trips in Europe. And on one of them, for instance, the guide was a young Italian guy who had a law degree and wanted to do international law, but who could not as yet get a job. So, and the unemployment in Europe, as you know, is much higher than it is here, even now. So their future prospects look fairly grim. But the New Deal focused on the young people in a lot of ways. The Civilian Conservation Corps was for young men. The Public Works Agency, the PWA and the WPA, gave jobs to a lot of young people. The rights of labor benefited them as well. And already in unions, they were showing a lot of talent for organization. And they repaid Roosevelt for all this with terrific electoral loyalty. They were certainly the backbone of his support. And this, again, is quite a contrast to the political role the millennials are playing today, when many of them are disaffected and they're not voting that much. I should lastly say a word about the silent generation, which was born starting in 1925. And that's one of the harder dates, the firmer dates that we have. And there were kids during the Depression. As you might expect, they had very protected childhoods. I'm sorry, I just thought of somebody who's not here, as it turns out. I thought we were going to have a member of the silent generation here, but we don't. She may show up next week. Anyway, they were basically there, and they grasped this, I think, to make their parents feel better about life. Now, the first silence to become a national figure was Shirley Temple, who was simply endlessly, adorably cute. And actually, you see people like that in a lot of the movies. Now, did anybody notice the member of the silent generation in They Made Me a Criminal? Come on, you can do this.
It was the boy, wasn't it?
Yeah, the rich kid who
the boy that got fleeced.
That got fleeced, exactly. Yeah, and he's kind of a figure of fun as well. And there's another character named Kiwi like that in Boy Town too. He's on the TV show. We'll be seeing a lot about the silent generation and their very interesting lifestyle down the road. But now, okay, we are at They Made Me a Criminal at long last. And to begin with, who would like to try to identify some of the generations in the film?
Well, sure. I'll
see. Yeah.
So the hero is definitely a GI.
Yes, he is.
As are the boys at the ranch and the love interest.
Yes.
And then some of the investigator played by Claude Rains, who I guess is the heavyweight actor, would be lost.
Yeah.
And so are some of the other older guys that kind of really treat our hero very roughshod, like his manager and his lawyer.
Right. Very good. Now, John Garfield.
The grandmother.
The grandmother, yeah, what? Who said that?
She would be, lost, I guess.
No, she's a missionary.
Okay, that's what I was wondering, but.
Well, did you notice who that was? The actress.
I knew she was some name, but I couldn't figure out who it was, no.
Okay, her name is May Robson, and she was an amazing character actress.
Yeah.
And actually, she was 80 years old when they shot that movie. She's actually a progressive generation by American standards. And she was an amazing actress because here she's playing a hardcore Irish woman, but she is also, in one of my favorite movies, she plays Katharine Hepburn's crazy wasp aunt, Mrs. Carlton Random, in Bringing Up Baby. And she's in a lot of other things as well. But she is definitely a missionary, yes.
But why do you say she's definitely? Because the Lost Generations starts in 1884, right?
Yes. I think she is more than 55 years old. I think that's a safe.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now, John Garfield will be known to some of you as film buffs. he actually is an exact contemporary of my parents, born in 1913 and born in Brooklyn, as my father was. And he really was a terrific actor with a lot of charisma. He had had heart disease since he was a kid, and he died of a heart attack in 1953. So he did not enjoy the length of career as Henry Fonda or Kirk Douglas or John Wayne or the other greats of that generation, but he certainly could have been, and he was in a lot of movies, including a lot of film noir. Now, the Dead End Kids, as they became known, the other boys, from 1937 or so for the next 4 years, they were in 12 different movies. It was like a long-running sitcom. So they were, and a couple of those movies are very well known. A lot of them passed into oblivion with nobody missing them, I'm sure. But they were stock characters. They're called the Dead End Kids because the first movie they were in was called Dead End. Now, there's already been some reference to this. Well, a couple of things. First of all, okay, how we get to know Jack as he comes to be, Johnny, really. In the first 20 minutes, what do we see about him?
Well, we first see him in the ring.
Yes.
From a distance, doing battle, and I actually was curious about the speed with which that section was being run. It seemed to be at a higher speed than normal.
I think that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
He came across as a con man. I mean, he was projecting this image of an upstanding boxer. Right. He loved his mother. He wasn't drinking, but he obviously was nothing like that. He was indulging himself in all kinds of pleasures and hiding that from his public.
Yes, and what that tells us is he knows what he is supposed to be in the public eye.
Yeah.
And what a nice young man of his generation is supposed to be. And in fact, his real life counterparts, like Joe DiMaggio, Ted Williams, Bob Feller, many more, Williams was a little different because he was such an eccentric, but almost all of them projected that kind of image, and so did Joe Louis, even though in many ways it was not the truth for them either. And it turns out he's thinking only of himself, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, what is the view through his eyes that you get of the older generation, of the lost generation, as represented, as Steve already mentioned, by his manager and his lawyer? Yeah, Jack.
They're a bunch of sharks out to eat everyone that they can, essentially. His manager screws him over $10,000. He's being chased and hounded by them, and you see the cynicism he brings to the ranch is, oh yeah, what's the game you're playing? It creates a kind of cynicism in him. He's been in a tank of sharks, and that's what he views older folks as.
Right. And I know, and some of you do, from our intergenerational Facebook page, that quite a few millennials have a very cynical view about the older generation and how the older generation has treated them as well. So that is something of a parallel. Okay, then he winds up on the...
But David...
Yeah.
Yeah, but David, the Claude Rains character in the end...
Let's everything in its place, okay, James? We'll get there.
I mean, before you toss all the lost under the bus.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And that's a wonderful moment, and we'll get there. Yes.
David, there was one exception though. That was the Ward Bond character was not as nasty as the others of his generation. He was rather pleasant and understanding and nice.
Yes, he isn't as old. Ward Bond actually is a GI. But yeah, he was nicer. That's true.
No, he was older. He was older than Jack.
Yes, he was older than Jack. That's right. Janie, you had your hand.
Okay, what I found interesting is that where Jack is a GI, and this movie was obviously written and produced before the World War II, and certainly long before we, now looking back, have a different idea or perception of the whole GI generation. And when I was first looking at the movie, I had to stop and think what generation they were. So could you talk about how Jack fits the characteristics of the GI generation as opposed to what we know them as the great heroes after World War II? Because this was before the war.
Oh,
And then-
sure. But I think that is the real drama of the movie, and I want to get to that in a minute. But I want to talk a little bit about something else first. Okay, Jack meets with the gang and falls in with the gang, and this is not the first time you're going to hear this kind of question from me. It's not the last time you're going to hear this kind of question from me. What do the scenes with the gang tell you about how they see each other and what makes a good guy, what makes a bad guy, what's the virtue, what's the vice, etc.? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, they're all on probation. They're kind of a little gang,
Yes.
but they try to stick up for each other. And that scene in the water thing was they were all saving each other.
That's right. And Jack's taking the lead in that. Yes, Susan.
When we first meet them, there's a certain quality, to me anyway, that they seem to have about who they were, in the sense that they were there because they were delinquents of one sort or another, but they didn't really think that they were all that bad. They also expressed appreciation for, or acknowledged anyway, the presence in their life of the priest who had taken them in and basically, sent them off to this ranch where they could make something of themselves and be cared for and so on. So they seem to have, they weren't tough, irredeemable kids by any stretch of the imagination. They were actually quite likable.
Yes, and you get the feeling that they could go either way, depending on the guidance they get, the role models
They could have,
Yeah.
but they had been redirected in a more positive path. Yeah.
I would point out, okay, being able to take care of yourself physically is very important.
Yeah.
And in fact, the whole role of boxing in the movie, boxing in the 30s was the #2 sport in America, behind baseball. Football, much less basketball, did not compare. And a lot of young boys gave boxing a try at some level. And in fact, one of my favorite episodes in the autobiography of Malcolm X, who was the first wave silent, I think it's more in 1926. It's right at the beginning, when he's growing up in Lansing or wherever, and he's gotten involved in some boys boxing program, and he has to go into the ring against the white kid, and Joe Louis has just become heavyweight champion, and he knows his whole community is behind him, and as always, he's so frank, he gets the living crap beaten out of him, and he's so ashamed he's gonna go home, but it's a funny but a very revealing story. Okay, but now we are getting to the nitty gritty, because what is, and this goes to your question, Janie, what is the key change that Jack undergoes? And why does he undergo it?
Can you repeat the question, David?
What is the key change that Jack undergoes? Yes, Michael.
So I thought a key change he underwent was that he fell for the love interest at the ranch.
Yes.
And I was really struck by the scene in which he decides to stay, because I mean it's just a very there's like no explanation for it. You know, in the one hand, the kid is begging him to stay, and he's packing up his. So this is a little further on, but he does.
Wait, are you talking about on the eve of the fight?
Eve of the fight, yeah.
Okay, yeah, right. Okay.
But let me stop and let me answer your question. Yeah, he falls for the woman on the ranch.
Yes. And she persuades him in that scene in the car that if she's going to fall for him, he has to show her something different. And what is the
Honest.
Go ahead.
Yes, he has to be honest with her. He can't lie. He can't lie to her. He has to basically tell her who he is and what he's all about.
Well, okay, but what is the next thing that happens to him after they have that conversation in the car?
He's discovered, I guess, isn't it?
No. I believe it's the very next scene is when he sees, I'm sorry. It's when he sees the poster about the boxer coming to town.
Yeah.
And
He
he's
sees
already
that,
had the
and then
conversation about the pump.
Yeah.
And he realizes what he can do.
Right. And then he starts to prevaricate again. I mean, he's trying to explain to her why he wants to do this. He manages to find ways of kind of not telling lies, even though he's covering up in some way, and she senses it.
That's true, but to me the key is that he is going to use the skill he's got to save the ranch.
Right.
And
right.
That's right, and that changes everything. Yeah, and he decides to do that even when he realizes that he's going to get caught.
I have a thought about that.
Yes.
I'm not so sure it was his falling in love with the woman as much as his falling in love with the kids, because he seemed to really bond with them, and the fact that he was so important to them, I think, really had a profound impact on him.
I think that's true. Yes, and I love the scene in the tank too, because I mean, again, it's more foreshadowing. It's like he's the sergeant who gets them out of the tough combat situation on a Pacific island, and he figures out what to do, and he does it, and he never panics, etc., etc.
I have a question, please. I have a question, David.
Sure. Yes, Judy.
So are you saying that the GI generation was essentially at the beginning that they were cynical?
Okay, I think some of them were cynical, and some of them were selfish, and some of them were spoiled. And you do see that in a lot of the other literature from the period. And for instance, the Caine Mutiny is about that with respect to the story of the real protagonist, Willie Keith, who was a pretty minor character in the movie, but is definitely the main character in the book. And the war changed them. But I think, you see, I have seen this message in other places. When I was a kid in the 50s, I read a good deal of sports fiction for kids. And the plot line that recurred again and again and again was that the protagonist of the story would be some super talented athlete who was spoiled, stuck up, only cared about himself. And the coach had to do something dramatic to teach him about being a team player, which the coach would always succeed in doing. And that was, that is what happens to Jack, essentially, is that he realizes he has to be a team player too. And it's what happens to Mickey Rooney in Boys Town, which I had a couple of clips from, but I don't think we're going to have time to do them if we're going to wind up by 9:30.
Yeah.
Which is fine. But in fact, that's the whole point of Boys Town, which goes on again and again. It's these bad boys come and they learn that something else is more important than them personally. Yes, Jane. And
Yeah, I
then
mean,
Jamie.
is it okay to say that I felt like his turnaround actually was sort of a discontinuity? That it really didn't have adequate explanation. It seemed to, yeah, it was the girl, yeah, it was the boys, but it seemed to happen too quickly and without adequate explanation, and that was sort of a weakness of the movie.
Well, Chaz was just nodding very vigorously. I don't know. It was so long ago that I saw it for the first time. And since then, I've known what was going to happen. I think Janie had her hand up next, and then Susan.
Yeah, because it was first I was going to say that Jack, since this movie was made in 1938, right? And we're assuming that Jack is 21, 22, we think.
Looks about that, right? Yeah.
And realizing that the generation before, the Roaring Twenties, so that they're the culture of when they were children was in fact suckers and people taking advantage of each other and sort of the unraveling era. And then in this movie that we all watched, the crisis or the dilemma for the character is the struggle with, is everybody really a sucker or is there something more? But what I thought was unusual, and clearly in the end he decided that not everybody was going to be a sucker and they had another choice in life. But that when the detective caught him, and Jack was so willing to go back and face, what he thought was going to be prison or something, that it was like the rules were the rules and he was finally going to have to face the rules. I thought that was sort of unusual. I was expecting some resistance of some sort. But then when he gets ready to get on the train and the detective basically lets him go, the change in the detective's struggle, moral struggle, which doesn't want to mistake again and send somebody to be punished for a crime he didn't commit. I thought that was an interesting twist. And that guy was a lost, right? David, the detective. Yeah. So you have the lost guy trying to be more honest, fair, upright, and Jack deciding that not everybody could be a sucker, but that the other thread is structure and obeying the rules or not obeying the rules. But again, that Jack in the end was ready, I guess, to go to prison. And I thought that was weird. Why didn't he? I mean, what do you think about that for a GI?
Well, they certainly were brought up to believe that the rules were the rules and that you had to suffer for them. Now, as long as this has come up, I wanted to save it for the end, but we have a couple of other things to do. About Phelan, Claude Rains. His whole evolution through the movie is kind of interesting. Is there anybody else who would like to talk about it, or shall I just do it?
You go ahead.
Okay. He is bitter at the beginning. His career has gone totally sour because of a mistake. He's very angry because he knows he's smarter than most people, but he can't prove it. And he takes on the job of trying to find Johnny to prove that he's really still got it. And this is going to be a great triumph for him. As Jack says to him in the scene as they're walking to the train, you're really going to be a big shot when you said me. I'm like, but he's always trusted his own judgment, which is a very nomad Gen X kind of characteristic. And watching everybody around Jack, and also the stuff that he knew at the beginning, remember, because he knew the whole situation was kind of fishy and wasn't what they thought. He suddenly realizes that he's been wrong about this, and that he decides Jack is probably innocent and he's on a new path, so he is going to let him go. And the thing that strikes me about it is always no one else is ever going to know about this. None of the other cops back home he's not going to tell them anything. He's not going to tell them that he found them. He's not going to tell them anything. But he knows. And that's enough for him. And actually, some weeks down the road, I think we're going to run into something similar with another group of nomads, but I won't go into that now. Now, with time running out, I do want to share something else, which I think is quite striking. And it goes to something Janie said. In fact, I thought she was going to anticipate it, but she didn't, which I'm grateful for. Carried out to the end. And because she was saying how this is 1938 or 9, and the war hasn't started, we're not in it. A lot of people don't want to get in it. But there is a very remarkable piece of dialogue, for my money, that comes right after the fight. And I'm going to run that clip as soon as I can figure out how to do this. And now, for some reason, oh, there we go. Right. Okay, so this time I think I can do it right. So, oh no, there we go. I'm trying to. There. No. I'm having trouble. There we go. Okay. No, wait a minute. No, that didn't do it. Okay. There. No. Okay. There we go. I'm sorry, folks. I will have this in a moment. There we go. Yeah. Yes. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay.
What you think, Doc? Well, he took a pretty bad beating, but he'll come out of it all right.
Jack! Jack, are you all right? How is he, Doctor?
Just about the same.
Oh, Jack! Get up. Do you hear? Get up! Did you try vinegar?
We've done all we can for him.
Well, you ain't going to do much with that silly little tin ear trumpet, you know. Oh, Jack, come out of it, please. Oh, Jackie, come out of it. You're all right. Listen, oh, he did it all for us. He went off and got himself killed just for us.
Any comments on that last line there?
Well, I mean, that's foreshadowing for sure.
It sure is. He went out and got himself killed just for us. And here, I hope I can do this one a little more quickly. I'm sure I can. Is another foreshadowing scene. This one from Boys Town.
From what?
Boys Town. Okay, now I'm having the same issue. Okay. Right, I found the 50%.
Freddie, Tony! Sister, what's happened? The boys, they're all gone.
I don't know, Father.
I do, Father. They've gone to Boggs Tavern after Whitey.
Boggs Tavern?
Please, find Whitey, Father.
All right, Pee-wee. You go to sleep now.
Oh, Tony. Haven't I troubles enough without all of you going crazy?
We're not crazy, Father. Whitey's with his pals, and we're gonna get them.
You'll do nothing of the kind. They may be murderers. There's been a man killed.
They can't kill all of us, Father.
So that's the way you feel about it, huh?
Keep out of it, Father, will you, please?
No. Bless your hearts. Turn out those lights. Let's go.
Yeah, more foreshadowing. Okay, Boys Town, which I could have used just as easily, but I think this is more fun, is all about the same lessons and all about learning not to be stuck up and learning to sacrifice for the institution. The group is more important than the individual. Those were the values that that generation was being taught, I think. Those were the values that the war did much more to instill in them. We'll be looking at that very definitely next week. And then we will see the GIs carry those same values, both for better and for worse, into middle age in different contexts and create the particular society that some of us were born in and grew up into in the 40s and 50s and early 60s. So,
David, I've got a question.
Sure.
Yeah, I hate to ask questions right at the end of a
It's okay.
time period.
I was going to ask everybody if they had anything more, so go ahead.
But at the risk of doing that, I certainly saw this as a pre-war movie, and I saw the transformation of Jack to have a sense of altruism and duty. I saw that in some sense as an effort of a previous generation to both redeem the upbringing they had given to the younger generation, and then also redeem themselves. That somehow, maybe they felt, a crisis was coming. They were not up to it. They were not of the right age, and they needed to kind of finally, one last time, try to teach the young that it was now their time to step up. And so I saw it as kind of an attempt on an older generation to preserve their legacy, or at least try to redeem themselves. As a boomer, I feel that kind of personally.
Okay, our millennial Chaz is very eager to comment on that, so go for it.
Well, in some respects, I would definitely have to agree with Kevin in that it comes off a bit as kind of wish fulfillment of, well, here are these kids. They're not completely how we imagined they would be when they grew up, but we can try and give them goals and hope that they go in the way we wish they would, kind of thing. So I would definitely agree with Kevin's analysis there of it.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I had one thing I can't resist saying, talking about foreshadowing, and maybe it was because Claude Rains was in the movie, but the final scene reminded me so much of Casablanca.
Yes, it does.
And I almost felt like they were going to say to each other, this is the start of a beautiful friendship.
Yes, it did. That's true. And actually, both Claude Rains and Bogart in Casablanca are classic Lost Generation. And what happens to Bogart at the end of Casablanca is very similar to what happens to Jack.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'd say this was a fine start, and thank you all very much. And I will look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you. It was great.
Not at all.
What's the next movie?
Mr. Roberts.
What's the next movie?
Mr. Roberts.
Mr. Roberts. Okay. Got you.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Great to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.